Marshall recalled the case of the twins, Brendan and Valerie, and her strained relationship with them. She had once believed it was because of her red hair. One day, a young girl feeling out of place with her blonde-haired family cried out in confusion about her differences. Her brother, upset, harshly told her to go away, accusing her of being unworthy of their family due to their mother's occupation as a fortune teller. The little girl, hurt, tried to deny his words, but her brother's cruel remarks continued, calling her illegitimate. Although the siblings repeated what they'd heard from the nanny, Marshall knew what it meant to be an illegitimate child. The sting of those words left a mark, and she was painfully aware of her position because of her red hair. The girl, determined to defend herself, insisted she was truly part of the family, but her other sister mocked her for being an illegitimate child. When the little girl demanded that they take back their words, her brother shoved her, though she didn't fall hard enough to be seriously hurt. The scene left Marshall with a lingering headache, and she felt dizzy. The maids quickly gathered around, calling for help, trying to revive Marshall after she had fallen down the stairs. The confusion surrounding that day only deepened when it turned out Marshall had passed away from the fall, an event that would change her life forever. However, she clarified that she hadn't died, but had instead gained the ability for her soul to leave her body at random moments, particularly when she fainted or slept. This peculiar condition led her to explore the world beyond her noble restrictions, moving freely in her ethereal form without anyone noticing. Her curiosity led her to many places, including the mountains and the market, where she even enjoyed a bard's song. One day, while drifting through her usual wanderings, Marshall noticed her brother sneaking around in dark clothes, clearly on his way to the gambling den. She sighed, finding it typical of him. Although he couldn't hear her, she decided to interact with him in her ghostly state by touching him, which startled him, causing him to spin around in fear. Marshall found his reaction amusing and scolded him for sneaking out so late. Watching him closely, Marshall realized he was desperate to go out, so she decided to use her newfound power. She could possess the bodies of others, human or animal, but only under certain conditions. She'd been reluctant to use this power often due to its limitations, but her brother, while strong, was easily frightened, making him a perfect candidate. After quietly slipping into his body, she put him to sleep and left a note behind, writing, "Do not sneak out at night, just to ensure he stayed in bed for a while." As she left his room, she couldn't help but reflect on her situation. Even though she was seen as an illegitimate child, Marshall had found a way to enjoy life on her own terms. With her red hair and strange abilities, she had learned to navigate the world in a way that suited her, pondering how many sunrises and sunsets she had witnessed since the day her life had changed forever. The following morning, Valerie eagerly tried to show Marshall something, but Marshall wasn't particularly interested. Despite Marshall's indifference, Valerie was determined for her to take a look. It was a photo of Lord Dickens, a man Valerie had already told Marshall about. Marshall, however, had warned Valerie about Lord Dickens' gambling addiction and how he had been seen with Brandon at a gambling den. Marshall had previously advised Valerie not to marry him, and now Valerie seemed to want her help once again. Marshall sighed, trying to explain that she had simply thought Lord Dickens was not a good match for Valerie. But Valerie, pressing the issue, asked about another man. Marshall reluctantly admitted that this was her fault. After all, the Lydians' family was renowned and influential, dating back hundreds of years, founded by the grandson of the first emperor. Marshall's father, Count Lydians, was the head of the imperial treasury, and her family had a history of military glory, with both her grandfather and uncle serving as generals in the conquest of the northern tribes. Still, Marshall knew how complex these matters could be. When Valerie turned 22, she had fallen in love with the eldest son of a marquis, and they were preparing for marriage. But 2 months ago, something happened. Marshall had come to visit them, hoping to find something of interest. But as she wandered the halls, she overheard noises downstairs. Curiously, she descended to find a gathering. It turned out that a party was being held, and Marshall was shocked to see not only the Marquis's son, but also his wife, something Valerie hadn't mentioned. A friend of the Marquis commented on how he had managed to keep his family hidden for so long. The Marquis explained that he had kept them in hiding in order to use the power of the Lydians family for their benefit. He also confessed that he needed to revive a baron so that his wife could become a noblewoman. Marshall felt a rush of disbelief and confusion. How could he think he could take the first daughter of the Lydians family as his second wife? As the conversation continued, Marshall was struck by the audacity of it all. The Marquis was planning on solving all of his problems through this marriage. He believed that as long as the Lydians family didn't call off the wedding, there was nothing they could do to stop him. Marshall, unable to keep quiet any longer, was furious. Before she could act further, one of the Marquis' friends, already drunk, started muttering about the cold night and how he was feeling strange. Seizing the opportunity, Marshall took control of his body and began to move him. When the Marquis noticed, he was horrified to see Valerie standing in front of him, full of anger. The Marquis, flustered and in shock, tried to explain, but Valerie was beyond hearing him. The entire scene became a blur of crashing sounds as Valerie vented her fury. Marshall, covering her ears to block out the chaos, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. It would certainly be the talk of the town for some time. Back in the present, Valerie was once again showing Marshall something. This time, it was a new photo, but Marshall remained unconvinced. She remarked dryly that Valerie would never find a man who had no flaws. If Valerie couldn't stand a person, then she shouldn't waste her time. But Valerie, hurt, cried out, questioning how Marshall could be so heartless, implying that Marshall wanted to hand her over to just anyone. Marshall quickly tried to clarify, but Valerie wasn't listening. She tearfully accused Marshall of still resenting her for what happened in the past, referencing the scar Marshall had gotten from the fall years ago. Marshall sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation. She knew what Valerie meant. Her scar had been a painful reminder, and it had likely affected her own prospects as well. Marshall felt the same way about her situation. Despite her age, no marriage proposals had come for her. As an illegitimate child with a visible scar, there was little incentive for anyone to marry her. Her family rarely spoke of it, but Marshall could sense their disappointment. She was the third child, the one with the mark of illegitimacy. Valerie, the perfect daughter, would soon marry, and Brandon's gambling problems made him unreliable. Marshall had already decided that when she came of age, she would dedicate her life to service at the temple, leaving her family's expectations behind. Valerie, wiping her tears, suddenly made a declaration. She had decided that this would be their one last chance and started making plans. Marshall, confused, asked her to clarify, and Valerie began talking excitedly about the upcoming return of soldiers from the north. With a truce in place, these soldiers, no doubt weary and longing for companionship, would soon return home. Valerie believed this was the perfect opportunity for them to attend a magnificent party and, using their charm, melt the frozen hearts of the soldiers. She was certain they would fall for them instantly. Marshall, now fully alarmed, pointed out that northern women were renowned for their beauty, but Valerie, undeterred, insisted that Marshall would be coming with her. Marshall was shocked and reluctant, but Valerie was insistent. If Marshall was a noblewoman, she needed to act like one and actively seek courtship. Marshall, stunned, protested, but Valerie ignored her objections, rushing off to pick out a new dress. Marshall, standing there, muttered to herself that there was no point in attending a party at the palace. It wouldn't matter whether she was there or not. Valerie had plenty of friends to enjoy the event with. Little did Marshall know, this party she dreaded attending would soon turn her life upside down. At the palace, the sounds of chattering filled the air as Marshall tried to navigate through the crowd. She muttered to herself, struggling under the weight of her dress. She wondered aloud whether the dress she wore was heavier than a chandelier. As she scanned the room, she noticed that Valerie had darted off the moment they arrived, and she felt slightly abandoned. Marshall couldn't help but question why Valerie had insisted on bringing her to the party if she was just going to ignore her. At least, Marshall thought, the food looked promising. But she reminded herself not to eat too much. After all, she was stuck in this dress. Marshall overheard someone mention the term barbarian, and her interest was immediately piqued. She repeated the word to herself. The barbarian? A voice then announced the arrival of a guest, drawing the attention of the entire room. The promised princess, the announcer declared, Her Royal Highness, Princess Sasha von Dufay. Marshall's mind began to race as she recalled what she had heard about the princess. Sash was a figure who had played a crucial role in ending a long war, a war that had devastated her country, the land of snow and ice. Despite being branded a barbarian by her enemies and a traitor by some of her allies, Sashay had extended a hand of peace to all without discrimination. Marshall also recalled that the princess was about her age, which made her curious about what Sashay might look like. Then, the voice of the princess herself rang out. "Good evening, nobles of the Empire. I am Princess Sashay von Dufay, the royal princess from the land of snow and ice." Marshall couldn't help but admire how neutral Sashay's accent sounded, which she assumed had taken considerable effort, given the differences in pronunciation between the northern and southern dialects. Marshall noted that the announcer had also introduced another guest of honor, Duke Tamex Ludvillian, the second guest. He was noted for his role in leading the Imperial Army through the north. Marshall remembered hearing that under Duke Tamex's command, the forces had suffered the fewest casualties. His reputation as the Empire's ice wall was well known, and it seemed fitting given the role he had played in the war. Marshall reflected that it was odd seeing two former enemies now standing side by side. The sight of them made her realize just how much had changed. There was no more war. Suddenly the crowd shifted, and Marshall was jostled as someone pushed past her. She yelped, nearly losing her balance in the sea of people. She was about to fall when someone unexpectedly touched her from behind. Annoyed, she turned and fumed to herself about the shamelessness of whoever had done it. When she glanced back, she saw that it was none other than Duke Tamex himself, who had glanced at her without saying a word. Feeling indignant, Marshall thought to herself that she was the victim in this situation. But before she could process the moment, she was pushed from behind again and tumbled to the ground. As she fell, a cup of juice spilled across her, and the entire room seemed to erupt into whispers and laughter. Marshall was certain that everyone would gossip about her, saying that, as the illegitimate child, she had no manners and had clumsily rushed to see the princess, only to embarrass herself in front of everyone. The humiliation stung, and she feared that her reputation would be forever tarnished. Just as she began to feel the full weight of the situation, Princess Sash approached her, offering an apology. Sash expressed regret for causing the commotion and said that it seemed to have disturbed Marshall. Marshall, still flustered, reassured Sashi that she was fine and politely accepted a handkerchief offered by the princess. Sashi, with a slight smile, remarked that it was fortunate Marshall had red hair because the tomato sauce stain was noticeable and wouldn't be easily hidden. She suggested that Marshall wash off the stain, adding that it would be difficult to conceal the smell. Marshall, still in disbelief, managed to force a laugh and said her goodbyes. Sash moved on with the crowd, leaving Marshall still kneeling on the floor. Marshall could only reflect on the absurdity of it all. What just happened? She thought, feeling humiliated. She groaned inwardly, dreading the next 4 days of the party. She would rather die than endure this ordeal any longer. After returning home from the party, Marshall went straight to her bed feeling utterly deflated. She muttered to herself about how she had left the event looking like a mess, but then quickly dismissed the thought. No one cared anyway, she thought bitterly. She also complained about the discomfort of her room, wondering why they couldn't have given her one of the many guest rooms in the palace. Valerie, however, soon appeared at her door. "Marshall," Valerie called, noticing her already lying down. Marshall inwardly grumbled about the situation. Valerie and Brandon each had their own rooms, but she was stuck in this uncomfortable space. Valerie, seemingly unaware of Marshall's frustration, asked if she was asleep. Marshall, half laughing at her own situation, muttered under her breath, "I suppose an illegitimate child isn't a welcome guest." Suddenly Marshall's thoughts wandered. It felt as though her soul was leaving her body, and she realized that she had no idea where she was or how to navigate the vast palace. She cursed her lack of knowledge about the place, as she couldn't just ask someone for directions. If she didn't return to her body soon, Valerie would surely yell at her for sleeping in. She decided to explore the palace, figuring she would wander around for a bit. She knew that the important guests were assigned to the 3rd and 4th floors, and her curiosity was piqued. As she moved toward the floor, she couldn't help but wonder who was staying there. She reached a large area but quickly realized it wasn't a bedroom. The space between the floors was expansive, and it seemed more like a hidden or secret area, possibly built for protection in case of an attack. How large is this palace? She thought, her mind racing. Then, as she continued down the hall, something unexpected happened. She felt a strange sensation on her feet. What was that just now? Did someone just touch me? She wondered, her heart racing. She normally didn't feel much in her current state, even when she made contact with others. But this was different. Was someone in the bath nearby? Or had it all been her imagination? She shook off the feeling, but her curiosity about the space grew stronger. The rooms here were at least twice as large as her own. The only odd thing she noticed was an old bag sitting in the corner, catching her attention. To her surprise, there was something sparkling inside the bag. She leaned in to take a closer look. "A doll?" she murmured, noticing the golden fur and blue eyes. The doll looked strikingly similar to the people of the Empire. "Is a child staying here?" she wondered, though the doll appeared to be at least 10 years old. She wondered if it was so important that it had been brought all the way here. As she reached out to touch the doll's nose, something strange happened. She was suddenly sucked into the bag. "Huh? What is this?" she gasped, panic rising in her chest. She felt herself being absorbed into the bag and could no longer pull her hand out. How is this possible? She thought, struggling to understand what was happening. Within moments, she found herself inside the doll, and her surroundings felt completely different. What is this? It feels like a teddy bear. What's going on? She cried out in shock, struggling to make sense of her new predicament. She could feel the weight of whatever was surrounding her, and fear set in as she realized she couldn't escape. How do I get out? She thought, her heart pounding. As she struggled inside the bag, her movements made noises that caught the attention of someone nearby. A voice asked, "Who's there?" Marshall froze. The voice was deep, unmistakably male, and sounded none too friendly. She quickly covered her mouth, hoping the person wouldn't find her. Please, just walk away, she thought desperately. The man approached and opened the bag, seeing the doll inside. His expression was curious, but unfazed. Well, who would have thought, he murmured, clearly intrigued. He inspected the doll, then shrugged and muttered, perhaps it was a mouse. Marshall's mind was racing, still trying to make sense of what was happening, but her confusion only deepened when the man spoke again. Is this my precious teddy bear? He mused aloud. And then Marshall's mind went completely blank as she realized who this man was. The voice that had sounded so cold and indifferent belonged to none other than the hero of the Northern War, known as the Empire's Ice Wall, Duke Tamex Ledvillian. Duke Tamex had turned around and walked away. Marshall had nearly screamed, fearing he had been caught. He thought about what could have happened if Tamex had discovered him. The possibility of being torn to pieces sent a chill through his mind. He also realized that any wrong move, like ripping the seams of the teddy bear, could affect his actual body, which terrified him. Initially, Marshall had believed he could conquer the world with his unique ability to possess beings, but he soon found out it wasn't so simple. Possessing humans proved to be far too difficult, especially those in good physical condition. It seemed to only work on the timid, those scared of ghosts, or people who were drunk and not fully in their right minds. Animals were easier targets, though there was one terrifying experience when he had possessed a rabbit and nearly been killed by a wolf. Marshall recalled that his possession ability never lasted more than 3 hours, and at first, he had considered it useless. But then he discovered the possibility of possessing inanimate objects, a revelation that made him reconsider the potential of his powers. He felt that this might be useful in the future, but for now, he just needed to get out of the situation safely, reminding himself that it would be just another day. As Tamex approached his bag, Marshall wondered why he was back. Tamex pulled out the teddy bear, and Marshall, still stuck inside it, was baffled by his actions. Tamex muttered something about the wind, but Marshall couldn't understand what he meant. Tamex then seemed to reflect on the war that had ended a month ago, expressing how he still felt tense and almost foolish for it. speaking to the teddy bear as though it were a confidant. Marshall, observing Tamex more closely now, couldn't help but notice how beautiful the man looked. His long silver hair and watery blue eyes were striking, and it was almost hard to believe this was the same person who had seemed so upset and in the wrong earlier. It was unbelievable. Tamex placed the teddy bear gently on the bed and closed the door behind him. Marshall briefly considered making a run for it, but then quickly dismissed the idea. With his short legs, there was no way he could escape undetected. It seemed safer to wait a bit longer, although he worried that if he were caught, Tamex might destroy the teddy bear. Marshall watched as Tamex changed clothes, grabbed a candle, and walked over to his bed. He lay down beside the teddy bear and began reading a book. Marshall reminded himself that as a doll, he didn't need to breathe or blink, even though staying still for so long felt tiresome. He could manage it, though. Time passed as Tamex continued to read, and eventually, he closed the book and blew out the candle. It seemed that Tamex was finally going to sleep. Marshall, lying in the dark, lost track of time. He wasn't sure how long it had been. Half an hour? An hour? It was too dark to see anything, and he couldn't imagine sleeping in such complete darkness. It seemed that Tamex had fallen asleep, and Marshall wondered when he would finally be able to leave the doll's form. Boredom set in as he lay there, helpless. Just as he was thinking he should be able to see a little better by now, he realized that he still couldn't see anything. Then, to Marshall's surprise, Tamex opened his eyes. Sensing something behind him, Marshall quickly turned around, only to be caught as Tamex grabbed the teddy bear from behind. Tamex had apparently known all along. He muttered to himself that he had a feeling it was Marshall, confirming that he had been right. Marshall, in a panic, began to wriggle in fear, thinking that this was it. He was going to die. The terror of it all hit him as Tamex continued speaking, and Marshall realized the horrifying truth. Tamex had been pretending to sleep the entire time. He had been acting, and it made Marshall shudder to think how terrifying it was to have been deceived. Tamex stared at the teddy bear in disbelief, asking if Marshall was a demon. Marshall, still in the form of the teddy bear, recognized the sound of Tamex's voice and felt a wave of fear wash over him. Tamex unsheathed a dagger, and Marshall's heart sank. Desperately, he pleaded for his life, begging Tamex not to kill him. Tamex, confused, asked how Marshall knew his name. Marshall, equally shocked but trying to maintain composure, responded that of course he knew his name. After all, he was Tamex's beloved teddy bear. He reminded Tamex that he had taken such good care of him, that Marshall had been given a soul. He then begged Tamex to put the dagger down and hold him instead, feeling a flicker of hope that his plan might be working. To his relief, Tamex lowered the sword, and Marshall couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. He had always known that Tamex would never abandon him. Tamex then grabbed the teddy bear and began walking with it. Marshall, still trapped inside the stuffed animal, cautiously asked where they were going. He quickly thought better of his question and added that it would be a good idea to sit down and have a proper conversation. Tamex retrieved a flask of holy water from his bag and poured it over the teddy bear, testing to see if it would have any effect. Marshall, growing more frustrated, shouted that holy water wouldn't work because he wasn't a demon. He insisted that he was Tamex's beloved teddy bear and pointed out his golden fur and sparkling blue eyes, claiming that he looked angelic and couldn't possibly be a demon. Tamex, still skeptical, paused and then took out a nickel, which seemed to be a relic from a temple. Marshall was confused, wondering if Tamex was using it to try and prove something. Tamex pressed the coin against the teddy bear's face, but it didn't have any effect either. He sighed, muttering that it wasn't a curse or the work of the devil. Marshall, growing exasperated, once again insisted that he was just his beloved teddy bear. Tamex, still unconvinced, asked if Marshall had really come to life after being a doll for 10 years. Marshall, relieved that Tamex was finally taking him seriously, excitedly agreed, confirming that he had indeed come to life. Tamex paused, his expression thoughtful. He muttered that had he known about this before, he would have armed his army of clay dolls, which might have helped save more Imperial soldiers. Then, he questioned why Marshall had remained silent for so long, especially since he must have known Tamex's name for a while now. Marshall, slightly embarrassed, explained that he had been in a deep slumber inside the teddy bear. He confessed that he hadn't been able to wake up until Tamex showed him enough love. He added that Tamex's gentle words and warm hugs had lulled him to sleep for so long. Marshall then asked if they were friends, hoping Tamex would embrace him and accept him as more than just a doll. Tamex simply stared at the teddy bear for a long moment, as if processing the information. Marshall, feeling awkward, thought that it might be a good idea to stop questioning Tamex and simply be held. He wished that Tamex would smile and either hold him or go back to sleep, as they had a party to attend the next day. Suddenly, Tamex opened the window, and Marshall realized, too late, what was happening. Tamex seemed about to throw him out. Panicking, Marshall cried out, horrified that Tamex would dispose of him so easily. Tamex, however, calmly stated that he didn't believe Marshall's story. Even if he was telling the truth, Tamex insisted that he couldn't keep such a strange doll. Marshall, now desperate, reminded Tamex that they were on the 4th floor. Throwing him out of the window could be deadly. But Tamex, seemingly unconcerned, let go of the teddy bear, and Marshall screamed as he felt himself fall. "Tamex!" he shouted, cursing the cold-hearted man who had abandoned him. Suddenly, Marshall jolted awake, gasping for air. He was terrified for a moment, wondering if he had died and was now a ghost. But then he realized that he was perfectly fine, and the terrifying scene with Tamex must have been a dream. He tried to calm his racing heart, feeling a sense of relief. From the side, Valerie's voice cut through his thoughts, asking if something was wrong. Marshall, still shaken, replied that he had just had a bad dream. Valerie, sounding concerned, assured him that it was okay and that she was right there with him. Marshall, still processing the dream, wondered if Valerie had just referred to herself as his big sis. It struck him as odd, as she hadn't called herself that in years. But then, to his surprise, Valerie suddenly opened her eyes, seeming to realize something. She exclaimed that the sun was already up, urging Marshall to rise and shine. Marshall, still tired and wanting to sleep, groggily protested. Valerie, however, reminded him that there was a luncheon that day with high-ranking nobles. She mentioned that they might even meet the Emperor himself, encouraging Marshall to get ready. Marshall, somewhat skeptical, pointed out that the Emperor probably wouldn't even know their names, let alone remember them. Valerie, however, disagreed. She recalled that the Emperor had kissed her hand when she made her debut as a young lady, certain that he would remember her. Marshall, rolling his eyes, relented and agreed to get up. He was glad the strange dream was behind him, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he would have to face a lot of gossip from others about the previous day's events. As Marshall left his room, he sighed, wishing he could be left alone. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face everyone, knowing they'd be talking about him behind his back. He just hoped the day would go smoothly. Marshall visited the garden and noticed how quiet it was, wondering why the lazy nobles never ventured out at this hour. She admired the many beautiful flowers and thought about taking some with her. As she walked around, she spotted a figure and wondered if it was the gardener. Deciding to approach, she greeted him with a "Good morning, sir." The gardener returned her greeting with a polite, "Good morning, miss." Marshall, after a brief hesitation, asked if it would be all right to pick some of the flowers. The gardener looked at her, somewhat puzzled, and asked what she meant by flowers. Marshall explained that she wanted to take a few for her room. The gardener seemed taken aback by her question and asked why she had even needed to ask him. Surprised, Marshall wondered if she was supposed to ask someone else instead. The gardener, still with a neutral expression, told her to do as she pleased. Marshall muttered to herself that she didn't expect a servant to be so unfriendly. She then thought that if she picked a few flowers and placed them in her bath, Valerie would surely like them. Suddenly, a winged creature popped up near her feet, startling her. Marshall let out a small gasp and thought to herself, "Heavens, why am I so unlucky? How many times have I fallen since yesterday? Wait, did the bird die from being trapped by these thorny vines, or have I just happened to die here?" The gardener noticed her reaction and asked if she was all right. Marshall quickly assured him that she was fine, though in her mind, she felt it was quite disgraceful to be in such a position. She declined his offer to see the palace physician, feeling embarrassed by the situation. She bent down to examine the bird, feeling a sense of discomfort. The gardener, seeing this, asked why she was bothering with it. Marshall explained that she couldn't let anyone see the poor creature. It might startle people, and there was no place to bury it. She decided it would be better to burn the bird's body rather than leave it for others to step on, taking it to the furnace. The gardener seemed unconcerned and suggested that it wasn't necessary to go so far. He asked how it would matter if the bird's body was stepped on, implying it wasn't something she needed to worry about. Marshall, however, insisted that it was unpleasant for her, and she was sure others would think the same. She claimed to be doing it for the sake of everyone else, though she secretly admitted that it was more about her own discomfort. She added that just as he had helped her when she fell, she was helping the bird for her own peace of mind. At that moment, she suddenly realized the gardener had unusual features, with jet-black eyes and hair that made him look like someone from a foreign land. She nervously continued, explaining that she wasn't doing this out of kindness, but because she would feel uneasy if she left the bird there. She seemed to ramble on, then regretted speaking so much to a stranger. Marshall, feeling awkward, turned to leave, thinking to herself how hard it was to fit in. As the illegitimate daughter of a noble family, she was constantly criticized no matter what she did. Being extravagant made her seem arrogant, being frugal made her appear pitiful, being friendly made her a coquette, and being independent made her rude. She reminded herself to stay careful, avoid drawing attention, and live quietly. "You're not a noble daughter who can dream of fairy tales," she thought. The gardener suddenly laughed, which caught her off guard. Marshall looked back at him in confusion, unsure why he was laughing. He explained with a chuckle that he hadn't realized she was such an interesting person. He then asked for her name. When she introduced herself as Marshall, daughter of Count Lydiance, the gardener, now revealing himself, introduced himself as Unvian Rondami, a member of the royal guard of the land of snow and ice. He clarified that he wasn't just a gardener, which made Marshall feel embarrassed. She apologized for her mistake, realizing her assumption about his status had been wrong. Unvian reassured her that it was an amusing misunderstanding, and Marshall felt relieved by his easygoing response. They exchanged pleasantries, with Marshall hesitating over how to pronounce his name. Unvian corrected her when she stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, explaining that his name was Unvian Rondami, and laughing at her struggles. He gently assured her that the pronunciation was difficult for someone from her land and said he would be happy to help her next time they met. Marshall, grateful for his understanding, mentioned that she would love to learn the language of the land of snow and ice to avoid making the same mistake in the future. Unvian promised to assist her when they met again. With a final farewell, Unvian walked away, leaving Marshall standing there, thinking that his parting words implied they would meet again. She wondered if people from the north were always so confident in their future encounters. At the Emperor's luncheon, Valerie admonished Brandon to sit properly, reminding him that they were in the presence of His Majesty the Emperor. She urged him to show some decency. Their father, however, reassured them, telling his children not to be nervous. He acknowledged the importance of the occasion but emphasized that this luncheon was to celebrate the truce, and they should be grateful for the peace that had been bestowed upon them. He did, however, caution that while they shouldn't act improperly, they should remember the purpose of the event. Marshall, observing the gathering, thought to herself that with all the invited families present, it truly felt like a grand and formal event held by the Emperor. Her mother, noticing the tension, tried to ease the atmosphere. She suggested that the three children should simply behave with dignity as they always did. Marshall, however, couldn't help but think that if they behaved too properly, it might tarnish the great Lydiance family name. Then, her mother gently inquired about the incident from the previous night, asking if Marshall had been hurt after falling at the party. She expressed regret that she hadn't been there for her daughter, admitting she'd been busy talking with the other wives in the drawing room and only learned about what happened later. She wanted to know if Marshall had sustained any injuries. Marshall assured her that she was completely fine. Valerie, also concerned, apologized for not being there to help. Marshall, feeling guilty for their kindness, reassured her stepmother that she was all right. She reflected on how different her own stepmother was from those in stories, who were often cruel to their stepchildren. In reality, Countess Valerie treated her like her own daughter, brushing her hair and even putting her to sleep until she was 6, which made Marshall feel even more guilty. Their father, hearing about the fall, became protective, and immediately asked if someone had pushed her. He promised to take action if someone had humiliated her. Marshall quickly clarified that she had simply been swept away by the crowd when she tried to see the princess. Her father, still concerned, asked if she had been able to speak with the princess. Marshall confirmed that the princess had offered her a hand when she fell, and even lent her a handkerchief. Brandon, clearly curious, asked if something else had occurred between Marshall and the princess. Marshall assured him nothing had happened. However, Brandon didn't believe her, pointing out that her face said otherwise. Marshall, exasperated, replied that her face had always looked that way. Valerie, sensing the tension, quickly kicked Brandon under the table, but when he questioned her, she feigned innocence. Their father, growing tired of the bickering, ordered them to stop and focus on their food, as he had been summoned by His Majesty and would return soon. Marshall, deep in thought, recalled hearing that the Emperor and her late uncle had been close friends, and the Emperor had always treated her father like a brother. It became clear that her father's summons during the luncheon was a sign of this special relationship, though Marshall remained unsure of all the details. A maid arrived, announcing that His Majesty had summoned Marshall. She was surprised to hear that it was her, not Valerie, who was being called. As she turned around, she saw the Emperor waving at her, which only confused her more. Brandon, knowing she disliked being the center of attention, suggested he accompany her, assuring her he would return once they got there. Marshall, irritated, rejected the offer, telling him she was not a child. Marshall then greeted the Emperor, addressing him as the son of the Empire. His Majesty, impressed by her etiquette, remarked that she had excellent manners and that she seemed very much like her father in her composed demeanor. Marshall, feeling flattered, acknowledged his praise. The Emperor then explained that he had summoned her because he had heard something unpleasant had happened to her the previous night. He mentioned that she might be upset due to Princess Sash's carelessness and asked if she had been injured. Marshall quickly responded that she was perfectly fine and that the incident had been entirely her own fault. She suggested that it would be best not to speak of it too freely, as the princess was present. Princess Sashes, who had been listening, expressed relief that Marshall was all right, as she had looked upset the night before and assumed she was angry. Marshall, slightly confused, recalled the princess's earlier words. She apologized to the princess, explaining that her face might have given the wrong impression, but in reality, it had been her own carelessness. She had been distracted by the food at the time. To her surprise, the princess reacted with surprise, asking if food had been the cause of Marshall's distraction. She teasingly asked if Marshall had been looking at Duke Ludvillian instead. Marshall, now understanding the situation, realized that the princess might be trying to cause trouble by implying something inappropriate. Princess Sashes then backpedaled, apologizing if she had been rude. Marshall, however, was still perplexed, wondering if the princess had forgotten what had actually happened. Just then, Unvian arrived, apologizing for the misunderstanding. He explained that he had met Marshall only for the first time the night before and that they had accidentally bumped into each other in the crowd. He clarified that they had made eye contact only because they had both been apologizing. Marshall, trying to keep a straight face, thought to herself that it was strange for people from the north to apologize in such a manner, especially by touching someone's bottom. Unvian continued, confirming that they had apologized to each other, and Marshall reluctantly agreed. She then deflected the conversation, suggesting that the crowd's enthusiasm to see the princess had contributed to the confusion. The Emperor, amused by her response, praised her wit. Just as Marshall was feeling a bit more at ease, her father called her name, which made her tense up. She thought to herself that no matter what, she would never do anything to disgrace her family's name. She was acutely aware of her position and knew she had to be careful, always keeping her actions in line with the family's reputation. In a world filled with hardship, the story of a beautiful woman and a handsome man unfolded. Despite the adversity they faced, they eventually fell in love and lived happily ever after. Though it seemed cliché, the romance provided a sense of hope. However, the narrator couldn't help but wonder if their own struggles would ever lead to such a happy conclusion. If only they could be certain that happiness awaited them at the end of their hardships, they might find the strength to persevere. Meanwhile, a teddy bear was running, who had been at a dinner party, remembered retreating to his room and falling asleep shortly after. In the midst of his rest, he became aware of a cat chasing the teddy bear. Marshall couldn't understand why he had woken up in the form of this teddy bear and desperately tried to get away from the cat, to no avail. The cat pounced, and Marshall struggled. Marshall's thoughts were clouded by the situation, realizing that this was far from the romantic tales he wished for. In a brief moment of desperation, he called out to God, wondering if the divine might listen to him. He speculated that all of this chaos had started due to Tamex, a devout believer, and asked that God share some of Tamex's blessings with him as well. At that moment, the teddy bear managed to punch the cat in the face and scurry away, feeling a small triumph despite its cotton-filled form. Marshall laughed, feeling momentarily victorious as he hid in the bushes, tricking the cat into falling into a trap. As Marshall caught his breath and observed the situation, he overheard a conversation between Tamex and Princess Sashi. Sash appeared to be surprised by something she had said during a luncheon, and Tamex was clearly irritated. Marshall recognized the Duke and the Princess from the party and realized he had wandered close to the rose garden, just near the venue. Sashi seemed to be defending herself, claiming that she had only been trying to help Tamex, believing he would appreciate it. But Tamex was not convinced, accusing her of agitating him deliberately. Their exchange grew heated as they discussed their past conflicts. Sashay, in particular, seemed to harbor resentment, accusing the Empire of calling her people barbarians after their lands had been invaded. The tension between the two was palpable. Marshall, observing this, began to piece things together. He understood why the northern people disliked the Empire so much. Being invaded and then labeled as barbarians had clearly taken its toll. However, he was puzzled by Sashi's actions. Was she angry at him because of her distaste for the Duke? He found himself growing more irritated with her as he reflected on their exchange. He even wished Tamex would lose his balance and fall. The conversation between Tamex and Sashay continued, with Tamex attempting to reason with Sashay, urging her to cooperate. He reminded her of the long-awaited peace that was at stake, warning her that if she refused to cooperate, the truce they had worked for might be broken. Sashay, however, was unyielding. She shot back that the invaders were Tamex's people, not hers, and that she had no obligation to cooperate. With that, she left, leaving Tamex fuming. Marshall, still reflecting on the situation, found himself more and more at odds with Princess Sashi. He could understand the frustration of the northern people, but the princess's words only deepened his disdain. He couldn't help but wish for Tamex to lose his composure, and he muttered his frustration to himself. Suddenly, the cat returned, and Marshall's shock was evident. He once again screamed at the cat to stay away, but he found himself trapped by thorny vines, helpless as the cat continued to pursue him. Just as Marshall struggled, he heard Tamex's voice, demanding to know who was there and what was going on. The tension in the air was thick, and Marshall, now caught in an uncomfortable predicament, had no choice but to face whatever came next. Tamex recognized the teddy bear and commented on its presence, which caused Marshall to snap back, asking why Tamex was even there. He explained that it didn't concern him, but Tamex replied that people might be startled by the sight of a strange doll wandering around. Marshall, growing more frustrated, shouted that he was stuck and wanted Tamex to leave. He cursed Tamex, swearing that he would resent him forever, pray for his downfall, and have nightmares about him. He also criticized Tamex for making such a big deal about him speaking, especially since they'd lived together for 10 years. Tamex glanced around, telling Marshall that he was being too loud. Marshall couldn't understand why Tamex seemed to be seeking revenge on a teddy bear, especially one that was shouting. Tamex then used his sword to free Marshall from the thorny vines, commenting that Marshall looked awful. He suggested that the teddy bear go find a new owner, especially since he could now speak. Marshall, feeling a mix of indignation and confusion, responded that no one would want a broken doll like him, and reminded Tamex that it was he who had thrown him away in the first place. Tamex, however, surprised him by saying that he would take Marshall with him, claiming he might have nightmares if he left him alone. Marshall, though still bewildered, thought it was at least better than being chased by a cat. Later, Tamex began washing the teddy bear roughly, and Marshall cried out for help, feeling the harshness of the treatment. Tamex finished washing him and casually asked why Marshall needed help, stating that dolls didn't need to breathe. Marshall, in frustration, explained that while he knew he didn't need to breathe, he disliked being in the water and felt heavy. As the teddy bear struggled to get out of the pool, Tamex picked him up and threw him aside, telling him to get out of the way as he needed to bathe and that his clothes were wet because of him. Marshall, feeling embarrassed, ran outside, briefly stopping to look at the footprints he left behind. He realized the prints didn't look like bear tracks and began to wonder about his real body. He recalled a time when he had been injured as a rabbit and survived even after falling from the 4th floor, thinking that perhaps his real body would be unaffected if his cotton arms or legs were torn. He even considered whether falling asleep might allow him to return to his true form. Tamex came out and called to Marshall, who was still lost in thought. Marshall, irritated, asked why Tamex kept calling him, and Tamex, concerned, asked what he was doing. Marshall, trying to sleep, responded that he was just trying to rest, though he was unsure if he could due to the cotton filling of the teddy bear's brain. As he lay there, he noticed Tamex had many clothes and casually commented that he wouldn't need to buy clothes for the new year. Tamex explained that it had been a long time since the emperor had seen his nephew, and that was why so many clothes were arranged. Marshall, curious, asked if those were Tamex's clothes, to which Tamex responded that only he and his bag were his belongings, as he had thrown away the rest because they reeked of blood. He then mentioned that the North was to blame for this. Marshall, confused, asked why Tamex had taken him back. Tamex responded vaguely, asking if Marshall meant the battlefield or the garden, and then dismissed the question. Marshall decided to drop it, thinking that Tamex probably needed something to do while he was asleep, but he refused to learn more about him. Tamex, however, reminded Marshall that he was still wet and couldn't leave until he dealt with the cotton sticking out of the teddy bear. Marshall, feeling uncomfortable, asked him to stop grabbing him like that, but Tamex ignored the request, stating that he didn't have any threads that matched the color of Marshall's fur. Marshall protested, saying he didn't know how to sew, and the idea of a teddy bear sewing was absurd. Tamex, however, insisted that Marshall come closer, revealing that he knew how to sew, since as a soldier it was a skill he had learned. He then pointed out that he had been the one taking care of Marshall all this time. Marshall, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and annoyance, remarked that Tamex must cherish him very much. Tamex quickly told him to shut up, and Marshall, still puzzled, asked if his name was Belle. Tamex denied it, explaining that Belle was his younger sister, who had given the teddy bear to him 10 years ago as a wish for his safety before he left for the battlefield. Marshall, now understanding, reflected on the fact that Tamex had kept his sister's doll for so many years. He felt a bit envious of their close bond, though he didn't have a bad relationship with his own siblings. Still, he couldn't help but ask if Tamex and Belle had been close. Tamex replied that they had been, but when Marshall pressed him about the present, Tamex's response was cold. "She's no longer here." Marshall, understanding the depth of Tamex's loss, realized that even though Tamex's voice remained emotionless, it betrayed a deep pain. Marshall felt a kinship with Tamex, sensing the shared loneliness between them, and despite the bizarre situation, he understood why Tamex might not want to talk about it. I am sure the story will become more interesting in the future. I am curious to know what will happen when the prince learns the true identity of his teddy. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.